The final target. CIA psychic exposed the non-human entity controlling Earth. The line wasn't supposed to be there. It is not a visitor, it is installed. That sentence slipped through redactions, past a 311 classification jump, and into a session packet tied to a real unit with receipts you can still FOIA. According to the file trail, the viewer locked onto something that behaved less like a craft and more like infrastructure, a grid that coordinated through geometry, not commands. Frames, triads, damping fields. The room went quiet because the implication wasn't contact. It was governance. You'll see verifiable anchors, the 1984 Mars exploration, transcript stamped with a CIA release mark, Project Stargate's Fort Meade lineage ending in a 1995 declassification, and timing that rhymes with Space Force's 2025 AI posture on orbital anomalies. You won't see a confession. You'll see patterns, equidistant nodes above hot corridors, interference that cleans a band when it should howl, and microstories with medical traces nobody can laugh off. They tried to burn context. So to understand why a single line sparked a quiet panic, we need to go back to the session where a trained viewer said the quiet part out loud, and the handler made a call he wasn't supposed to make. The contamination, the mission that went too far. It started like any other off-books tasking in the early 1990s. Sealed cue, verbal coordinates, structure over story. Stargate wasn't folklore. The unit had a budget line, oversight, and a paper spine that ran from SRI experiments in the 1970s through DIA custody and into Fort Meade by 1977, before it was finally renamed Stargate in 1991 and shut down in 1995. The protocol was muscle memory, baseline the physiology, breathe, ideogram, describe. The briefing was thinner than usual. No time window beyond current, no front-loaded context. The handler, a career NCO who lived inside manuals, slid the envelope over, fingers clear, voice steady. Maintain structure, report descriptors, don't chase narratives. The subject nodded, pen ready, the tape deck humming for chain of custody. We don't have the full transcript. What survives is consistent with how these sessions ran, and the words we cite here are framed as the viewer's claims, not certified facts. The opening sketches were geometry, not scenery. 3 points holding equal distances, faint arcs, then a second triangle offset above the first. It's layered, he said, not static. The handler prompted the checklist, size, function, composition. Function, the viewer said. Coordination. Damping. It shapes behavior through fields, not orders. He hesitated. Feels like an operating system. Biometrics ticked in the background. Minor microspikes the unit associated with strong EM environments. The room logger blipped and settled, and the handler wrote artifact with a thin underline, then kept the cadence. Composition? Not hardware the way we think, the viewer murmured. Distributed. Self-heals. Terra segment and load routes around. Source, the handler asked. Not human. Not biological, the viewer replied. Installed. He didn't lift his eyes. Installed. The protocol doesn't bless conclusions. It corrals them. The handler steered to risk and intent. Risk is proportional to amplification, the viewer said. When we amplify emissions, launches, mass movement, it constrains. When we quiet, it recedes. That line survives today because it was copied downstream before someone blacked it out upstream. The phrase became the session's gravity, a rule you can test without metaphysics. Define the between you keep describing, the handler said. Between layers, the viewer answered. Ground routes where geometry can be kept stable, quiet, shielded, some subterranean. In air, frames, triangular edges that harden a patch. In orbit, hubs, tiered anchors. Same template, different scales. That language, frames, triads, hubs, matches how later civilian overlays would describe equidistant formations that solved for position like trilateration math. He described hotspots shadowing our noise, nuclear complexes, grid corridors, ascent lanes, test ranges. It isn't out there in the visiting sense, he said. It's in the system. The handler asked the only question that matters when the words get ahead of the proof. Agency? It enforces embedded policy, the viewer said. Cognition through architecture. You feel constraint, not a voice. It's governance through ratios. The tape doesn't carry belief. It carries sequence. The claim, again the viewer's claim, unspooled into a stack the room could evaluate later. Layers. Equidistant nodes that reconfigure. Damping windows that go unexpectedly clean during stress. proximity to failure vectors before they stabilize. The handler took notes like a metronome and kept the subject inside structure, movement, surface, ambience. Movement, the viewer said. Triads hold spacing under drift. A roamer patrols the interior like a cursor, loitering near the vectors most likely to tip. That roamer behavior appeared months later in independent AI models trained to detect geometry rather than objects. Another rhyme, not proof. Ambience, the handler asked. Microwave at close range, the viewer said. Occasional gamma spikes as a byproduct when it manages failure modes. The medical checkout later logged transient nausea, cutaneous warmth, and a metallic taste, nonspecific symptoms seen in other EM exposure reports. The unit appended a polygraph earlier than usual. The synopsis used cautious phrasing, synchrony across channels consistent with memory-based recall, alongside a handwritten hedge. Sincerity is not equal to validity. A second hand countered, but not deception. Meanwhile, paper moved like a brush fire. At 3:11, classification jumped. New signatures appeared on the custody log, office codes that also show up on technology protection audits. Pages were pulled, redacted blocks replaced specifics with silence, and the handler found his own notes swapped for a clean summary that left the geometry but cut the sentence that stung. It didn't matter. Copies existed. Copies always exist. Inside the unit, whispers spread sideways, not up. Not aliens. Blowback. If the target lived where math lives, grids, corridors, orbital shells, any probe that amplified attention might trigger clamp behavior. That wasn't mysticism. It was a procedural hazard. A junior tech in the shop did what junior techs do, stole 20 minutes for a test no one authorized. He overlaid historical equilateral sightings against launch windows and major substation events. Imperfect but loud, clusters near loud hours, thin traces during quiet windows. Years later, he'd see the same posture, laundered through sanitized prose, in a 2025 Space Force AI plan about anomaly tracking across orbital layers. The session needed an end-state descriptor. The viewer offered one the handler copied verbatim with a long pause before the period. Planetary traffic control, but for trajectories, objects, signals, decisions we think are ours. That line can't be proved by a transcript. It can be weighed against behavior. Emergency NOTAM rectangles snapping on around test corridors. Spectrum notches going clean during dirty runs. Triads that hold spacing like surveyors while a fourth point drifts the way a fingertip finds a pulse. The handler marked end of session and did something he didn't do. He called a number from the wrong room. Within the hour, the file sprouted caveats and hands, and the word unauthorized appeared near contact in a margin someone else later struck out. Meanwhile, another margin preserved the original doubt. Artifact. Those dueling scribbles are the real story. Two minds wrestling over the same anomaly set, glitch, or interaction. Here's the part that outlived the burn. Whether you treat the viewer's words as error, intuition, or contact, the pattern he described kept rhyming with independent data. Triads above loud corridors. Clean spectrum windows where noise should peak. Brief human motor pauses reported under triangular frames while voices stayed calm, and wearables logged small HRV notches. And the rule, a sentence no committee can declassify or erase, kept showing up where anyone could test it. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. The file trail, what survived the burn. What's left isn't clean prose, it's dents that point like arrows. The cover sheet comes first, Fort Meade letterhead, Stargate in the header, classification blocks stamped secret with a subcompartment tag that doesn't match the unit's usual cadence. The session ID carries 2 extra characters you only see when a file hops a caveat midstream. Next to it, the handler's initials in blue ink circled once. That same circle reappears 3 pages later in a thicker pen, as if a downstream office needed to reassert lineage after the uplift at 3:11. Page math tells on the burn. 12 pages logged received. 9 pages released. 3 markers preserved as blanks. That is not how you bury a record you don't want anyone to see. If you want a ghost to vanish, you drop the count. If you want a ghost to haunt, you keep the count and black the meat. Here, the black bars come in template widths, alignment drift changing mid-document. Evidence of at least 2 different hands, 2 different days. Near the margins, the ink misses twice. A faint frame survives on one line, damping ghosts another. The line, "It is not a visitor, it is installed," doesn't appear in the released pages. It survives only because a downstream risk note quoted it before someone upstream replaced pages with summaries. Chain of custody reads like a heartbeat that stumbles. Standard route, subject to handler, handler to control. Then the 311 jump, classification elevated, 2 new names appear, same office code you find on technology protection audits and special access review teams. One of those names signs twice in 6 minutes, which only happens when a courier crosses a vault threshold under escort. Beside the second signature sits a time code that matches the logger blip in the room. Synchrony doesn't prove the source. It does prove tempo. Stapling mistakes turn human. The polygraph synopsis arrives stapled wrong. Front corner through 2 pages, not the top like the rest. Unusual, because polygraphs usually sit in a different folder. This one doesn't. It's stapled to the session packet with a form meant for credibility assessments, not counterintelligence sweeps. The synopsis uses careful language. Synchrony across channels consistent with memory-based recall. Beneath it, 2 hands argue in ink. One writes, "Sincerity is not equal to validity." The other adds, "but not deception," underscored. An arrow from that phrase points back to the session ID, anchoring physiology to a piece of paper someone else is trying to starve. The medical entry is terse the way clinic notes are: transient nausea, cutaneous warmth, metallic taste. No dramatics, but the phrasing, consistent with brief microwave exposure, echoes other logs outside psychic files. Substation text during oscillations, radar rooms after long burns, witnesses in hotspot houses. Correlation isn't confession. It is repetition. Annotations fight on the margins. On one copy, artifact sits underlined once. On a different photocopy, same page, same coffee stain at the bottom edge, someone has struck artifact and written unauthorized contact. That phrase belongs to an operational threat matrix, not a lab report. Both can't be right. Both reveal posture, error to be explained away, or interaction to be contained. Calendars tell you who flinched. A meeting stub shows a 15-minute block wedged between 2 standard briefs. Agenda line, uplift. Room, a vault number that doesn't appear on ordinary invites. Attendees, redacted. Organizer, an acquisitions officer who later appears on a 2025 AI procurement for space domain awareness. You can't prove they talked about frames in that room. You can prove the people who sign uplift forms also sign anomaly budgets. The geometry survives where they meant to crop it. 1 miniature sketch, 3 nodes, equidistant, an offset triangle hanging above, sits in a corner they couldn't black without erasing pagination. It's nothing by itself. It's everything when you lay it beside independent overlays that keep measuring the same distances in different skies. FOIA logs leave fingerprints. The request numbers show duplicates filed within hours by separate submitters, a tell that a summary memo leaked internally before the packet moved. The released versions differ by inches in the black. One shows the word roamer, half clipped at a line break. The other buries that line fully and leaves a different edge visible. Hold spacing under drift. You can reconstruct the sentence if you've lived in rooms like this. You shouldn't have to. Then there's the procurement breadcrumb, no one meant as a breadcrumb. A redacted justification references pattern of life analytics across orbital layers, language that doesn't belong to debris mitigation. It belongs to behavior. It appears the same quarter the custody log shows new hands on the packet. Parallel doesn't prove the cause. It does show synchronization between a sentence a viewer spoke and the budgets that quietly train machines to notice geometry. We don't have a single page that says governor. We have a pile that admits impact without blessing sources. We have 2 pens arguing over artifact versus contact. We have physiology tied to a session ID, a sketch left in a corner, and the one line someone wrote down twice before the bars went on. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. The file doesn't tell you who wrote the rule. It tells you the room heard it, a system hiding in plain sight. While the packet gathered dust under new caveats, the sky started writing in shapes you could measure. Not symbols, geometry. Independent trackers stitched verified clips and pilot reports across continents and got the same skeleton. 3 luminous points holding equidistant spacing, while a 4th drifted inside the triangle like a cursor. When the wind shifted, the spacing held under drift. When altitude estimates changed, the base length scaled proportionally. That's trilateration math, not pageantry. Here's where the caution lives. No single video proves intent. So people who build with code through the problem at models trained to find geometry, not objects. The outputs weren't stories, they were numbers. Clusters resolved into equilateral sets beyond what random placement would yield. The roamer didn't wander. It loitered near vectors that later showed non-nominal readings. Engine tests flirting with out of family, transformers ringing toward cascade, boosters flagging nuisance values that damp back into tolerance without a scrub. Correlation doesn't name a cause. It does narrow the list. Unknown to them. Across town, a utility engineer kept a notebook the way nervous people do. Midnight call, hot night, substation humming. A silent orb hung over the yard for 3 breaths. His nose warmed, then bled. His handheld meter popped a narrow microwave spike and settled. Minutes later, a grid oscillation that should have walked up the corridor didn't. He wrote 2 words in the margin, didn't propagate. In the morning, the outage that wanted to exist didn't have a paper trail. While that was happening in Colorado Springs, planners wrote the careful language institutions use when they mean more than they can say. In 2025, space domain briefs stopped pretending all anomalies were debris and started tasking AI to catalog structured behaviors across orbital layers. The phrasing was precise for a reason. Machines don't get bored. They notice patterns you can't handwave away. The public lines stayed dry. The procurement lines, pattern of life at altitude, cross-sensor fusion for non-ballistic tracks, said the quiet part sideways. Meanwhile, civilian observers did the impolite thing and aligned time. Launch surges? Triads concentrated over ascent corridors 20 minutes before windows opened, then eased away after nominal SEP. Hypersonic trials? Frames held station high while downlink logs showed unexpectedly clean spectrum during stress runs that should have howled. Grid peaks under heat? Equilateral sets idled above transmission spines right when oscillations threatened to propagate. During quiet windows, the formations thinned but didn't vanish. Systems that manage don't switch off. They modulate. Skeptics pressed where they should. Starlink trains flare. The ISS throws specular surprises. Drones can fly in formation. So teams filtered satellite catalogs, removed train passes, culled ISS windows, mapped sun angles, and cross-checked with NOTAMs and TFRs. After the subtractions, equilateral spacing kept returning inside tight tolerances across Arizona, Poland, Brazil. Different devices, different nights, same base ratios under drift. That's not a camera quirk. That's architecture repeating. A microstory again, small enough to feel true. A commercial pilot in holding watched a black triangle hang, and realized his hands paused without his consent for 3 seconds while his voice read standard callouts like a metronome. Later, his wearable logged a slight HRV notch at that exact minute. He didn't submit words like paranormal. He filed temporary motor reluctance, instruments nominal. Across the valley that hour, a family heard hard knocks roll through walls in impossible sequence and fled to a truck. An environmental logger downridge recorded a brief gamma blip. The house was fine at dawn. Relief sits next to violation in the same breath. Look at where the geometry likes to live. Over nuclear complexes whose outputs spike and settle like heartbeats. Along high-capacity corridors that hum when cities sleep. Above test ranges where trajectories change when math says they must. In the Pacific, along missile lanes when drills go hot. Frames that appear before risk peaks, hold during the loud minutes, and dissolve when ratios slip back inside tolerance. The pattern doesn't behave like visitors touring airspace. It behaves like a control surface stiffening and relaxing with load. Now remember the line the handler wrote and someone blacked out upstream. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. You don't need belief to weigh that sentence. You need calendars. Stack ascent windows, grid peaks, mass drills, and collision warnings. Then lay the geometry on top. Loud hours draw clamps. Quiet posture buys space. A coder in Sao Paulo shared his replication steps because trust travels with instructions. Verify EXIF. Align UTC. Subtract known birds. Estimate altitude with parallax. Measure base lengths and tolerance bands. He pushed his scripts to a public repo and dared people to break the result. Groups in Manila and Krakow reran the pipeline and landed on the same skeleton. Equilateral sets, interior loitering near failure vectors, clean spectrum notches matching clamps in time. They didn't declare their origin. They posted numbers. You won't find a page where an office admits governance. You'll find a posture that treats the sky like someone else already does the job. AI budgets to watch what radar can't classify. Emergency rectangles with no hazard listed snapping on and off like a shutter during test nights. Calm pilots with reluctant wrists. Families with trucks and blankets, and a dog that won't go back inside until the sun clears the ridge. None of that crowns a theory. It corners one. If a system can sense and steer through geometry, it hides best in plain sight, above us, along the corridors we built, inside the timing we control. Not a visitor. Installed. Not a message. A rule. Underground clues and the missing rooms. While the sky kept drawing triangles, the ground began whispering back, quiet geometry. Underfoot that didn't behave like caves and didn't read like mines. Teams running ground-penetrating radar in Utah mapped unervingly straight passages cutting bedrock with consistent cross-sections, then dropping into vertical shafts that opened into nodal cavities. The lines weren't karst meanders. They ran truer than geology prefers, then curved just enough to dodge a fault like someone planned for tomorrow's tremor. On the walls, glossy bands inches wide where stone looked heat-reflowed, not soot. Narrow scorched ribbons as if a tight field had slid along a surface and polished it to glass. Across an ocean, surveys outside the Cappadocia postcards traced arched galleries with keyed spans and regular spacing that felt more engineered than eroded. Some segments wore human signatures, tool marks that belonged to centuries you can name. Others felt wrong for history and too clean for tourism, like corridors maintained for access rather than living. Field notes documented flecks embedded in the walls that clung to magnets, microspecks that labs labeled ferromagnetic inclusions, while techs called them crumbs. Far south, in remote Argentina, vertical drops opened into honeycombs of sharp-cornered passageways that resisted the lazy curves of water. Near junctions, the same heat-burnished strips appeared at shoulder height, like lanes kept clear for something that doesn't like brush. Samples came back with microfractures consistent with short, intense thermal events, not campfires or blasting residue. When analysts measured distances between subsurface nodes and overlaid those spans onto surface maps, ratios rhymed with aerial base lengths recorded during equilateral holds above. Draw a bright line here. Law enforcement has documented sophisticated human tunnels, rails, ventilation, lighting, especially along the U.S. Mexico border. Those exist. They prove capability, not ultra-terrestrial plumbing. So we separated piles. Confirmed smuggling infrastructure sits in one stack. Unattributed geometry with vitrified bands and magnetic flecks sits in another. Similarities in craft don't flatten differences in purpose. Then came footage, the kind that splits rooms. In early 2025, exploratory cameras in a Utah passage captured a tall, elongated figure crossing a junction, proportions wrong for standard suits. Frames around it stuttered. Micro warps the way sensors twitch when you bring a magnet too close. A research lead called it localized timing noise. Critics called it compression artifacts and signal path junk. No independent forensic lab blessed it. Weeks later, clips from Turkey and Argentina surfaced with the same silhouette, the same camera indifference, and the same edge warping on entry. 3 disputed videos don't make proof. They do make a pattern that asks for better gear. A micro-story fits in a palm. A tech cataloging a scorch band in Utah felt his forearm prickle the way skin does near a live dish. His RF meter popped a narrow spike and calmed. 30 seconds later, a substation upstream logged a transient oscillation that self-stabilized without tripping. Driving back, he watched a faint orb idle along a transmission corridor and drift away when load eased. He didn't file that. He wrote it in a notebook he doesn't bring to meetings. The hypothesis that grew wasn't romance, it was routing. If visible orbs act like output nodes, a display layer, then you'd expect control surfaces to anchor where geometry can be kept steady. In sky frames, across arrays, and underground where temperature and vibration behave. Maintenance paths, as the viewer called them, would be precisely the quiet lanes a field prefers, shielded, stable, topologically consistent. The vitrified ribbons read like guide rails. The magnetic flecks like residues from tools we don't list on manifests. The elongated figures, if the clips hold up, like technicians moving along routes that keep a lattice coherent. Pushback belongs here. Geologists can name rare processes that glaze rock. Magnetic contamination has mundane sources. Without transparent provenance, every tunnel figure carries the burden of fakery. So investigators leaned on what can be tested now: geometry, timing, overlays. Do confirmed smuggling tunnels show the same vitrified bands and embedded flecks? Generally no. Do contested corridors sit beneath recurring aerial clusters? Enough do to keep the file open. Do spur routes beneath test corridors align with triangular holds above? Often enough to raise eyebrows in rooms that hate eyebrows. Another microstory. A family in a valley heard knocks walk the walls in a sequence no timber should perform, fled to a truck, and watched the house remain intact. Hours later, an environmental sensor 2 ridges away logged a neat gamma blip. The next morning, a drone clip showed 3 faint points holding equidistant above the transmission line that feeds the valley. A week after that, a survey crew quietly mapped a subsurface straight run beneath the same corridor. Think of the missing rooms as access, not absence. If the sky is a control surface, the ground is cable management. Behind tourist caves and criminal tunnels may live routes we don't own but still use, because geometry needs somewhere to live. And when the loud windows arrive, launch surges, grid hum, crowded lanes, those routes may carry the same fields that right triangles overhead, only now the handwriting runs under our feet. Triangles, templates, and paralysis. The triangles didn't arrive as legends, they arrived as sequences you could time. Phoenix remains the reference point because multiple synchronized angles let analysts test geometry, not belief. Clips stitched from different neighborhoods showed 3 bright nodes maintaining equidistant spacing, while the apparent body scaled with altitude. If it were a single rigid craft, the base wouldn't preserve proportionality under distance shifts. But in the footage, base lengths scaled as if the measuring sticks themselves, 3 nodes, were the structure. That's template behavior, not a fuselage. Pilots translated math into physiology. A commercial crew at 15,000 feet watched a black triangular frame ease along a fixed bearing with an absence of the usual cues. No buffet, no tonal shift. The captain logged a momentary motor reluctance, lasting roughly 3 seconds while voice and checklist stayed calmly procedural. After landing, his wearable showed a small heart rate variability notch at the exact minute he'd noted the hold. He didn't write mystery. He filed mechanics. That mismatch, the body hesitating while language stayed tidy, reappears often enough to stop being folklore and start being a signature. Thermal rigs stripped away romance. Research teams and hobbyists with stabilized IR captured triangles as negative space bounded by 3 hotter nodes. Stars remained visible through the interior. That's not a wing. It's a frame, an edge-defined field inside which physics didn't break, ratios did. Small drones entering those interiors slowed as if moving through syrup, then drifted sideways along vectors that rotated when the frame contracted or turned. When the edge length breathed in, drift vectors rotated with it. That's constraint tied to geometry. AI made it harder to call coincidence. Independent groups fed thousands of frames into models, tuned to detect equilateral spacing within tolerance bands. The models flagged repeated base ratios across Arizona nights, Polish cold air, and humid Brazilian skies. They also recovered the roamer behavior, an interior point patrolling likely failure vectors before non-nominal readings settled back into tolerance. The code didn't name intent. It measured repetition, equilateral spacing within tight bounds, interior loitering near risk, proportional scaling as altitude changed. Sequence mattered. In regions where Type 3 ground orbs clustered near infrastructure first, triangles tended to appear later at altitude rather than vice versa. That ground first, sky second rhythm matches what the viewer described in the room, layers engaging according to load. When grid corridors hummed at peak or launch windows stacked, frames formed, held, and dissolved after the loud minutes passed. During quiet hours, the template thinned but didn't vanish. The system modulated instead of performing. Paralysis accounts sharpened the edge. People beneath triangles described brief motor lock, seconds where limbs didn't translate intent while minds stayed boringly normal. A hiker froze mid-stride while her internal monologue carried on unremarkably. A patrol officer's foot hovered above a brake that wasn't there while his voice remained calm on radio. In scans and labs afterward, nothing dramatic, but on wearables, tiny HRV notches recur near the moments they circled in their logs. The common phrase isn't terror, it's reluctant. Constraint zones showed up in footage before anecdotes ever reached microphones. Consumer drones flown into frames slowed, yawed, and then traced arcs that defied wind data, aligning instead with edge rotation. When triangles contracted, vectors rotated with the geometry. That's not fear. its field steering motion inside a defined boundary. Skeptics take the right swings. Drones can fly equilateral. Formations produce clean edges. Atmospheric ducts can swallow sound. True case by case. But the template refuses to collapse under subtraction. Equidistant spacing inside tight tolerances while base lengths scale proportionally. An interior point that loiters over likely failure vectors before stabilization. Drift vectors rotating with edge motion and brief human motor reluctance paired with normal voices. These aren't the random byproducts of hobby swarms. Language matters here. Frames, not craft. Edges, not wings. A frame is an interface, geometry that defines where a field hardens. Inside, friction feels different, motors resist for seconds, signals damp. The viewer said, it shapes behavior through fields, not orders. You can weigh that sentence against drone footage without believing in anything more than ratios. A microstory ties a bow on a long week. A crop duster watched a triangle breathe as it held above a test corridor. The edge lengths shrank. The interior roamer slid toward a pad where a minor sensor nuisance had been flickering all afternoon, and the frame drifted off after the scrub. He didn't file a UAP report. He told 2 pilots over beers and said the air felt thick for a moment. Hours later, spectrum plots labeled "unexpectedly clean" slid across a console in a room he'll never see. Patterns care about posture, not pride. When the loud windows stack, launches, drills, grid hum, the triangles show up like tripods someone keeps moving until the picture steadies. When the load eases, the template relaxes. The short paralysis moments aren't theater. They read like safety interlocks, brief clamps when flesh wanders into a maintenance zone. So the triangles stop being mysteries and start being templates, equilateral edges deployed as local tools for a broader interface. The geometry is the point. The field is the method. The pause in your wrist, the syrup the drone feels, the calm voice reading back a call-out while the hand hesitates. That's the human cost of standing under a control surface doing its job. The session, what the viewer actually reported. The handler reset the room after the micro break, fresh tape rolling, pen lifted, voice back to checklist cadence. Anchor to the queue, he said. Describe the primary. Not a place, the viewer answered. An interface stretched across gradients, electromagnetic, gravitational, and the social kind when it gets loud. It's real in math first, then it throws pictures at you because that's how brains cope. Go to the dominant structure. 3 nodes, he said, sketching triangles in the air. Equidistant. Spacing holds under drift. Above them, a second triad offset, like a yoke. The edges are the tool, the interior is the work. Function. Coordination, he said. Damping. Steering. It shapes probabilities. You don't get an instruction. Your easy options narrow until you choose inside its tolerance. Composition. Distributed, he said. Self-healing lattice. Tear one segment, the load routes around. The smarts live in the architecture, not a central brain. Source. Non-human, he said. Non-biological in any way we'd recognize. Installed. He paused. Installed. Mechanics, the handler asked. Fields, he said. Microwave at close range to nudge, shape, and signal. Occasional gamma spikes as a byproduct when it manages failure modes. The frames define a boundary. Inside, ratios tilt. Motors feel syrup. Drones drift along vectors that rotate when edges rotate. Layers. Ground nodes where geometry can be kept steady, he said. Subterranean routes like maintenance paths, shielded, quiet, temperature stable. In air, frames, triangular templates you can measure. In orbit, hubs, tiered anchors tying regions together. Same template, different scale. Scope. Planetary, he said. It shadows our loudness. Nukes spiking. Grids ringing. Launch corridors hot. Crowded orbital shells after collisions. It moves first where ratios threaten to go nonlinear. Agency. Embedded policy, he said. Not chatty, not reactive panic. It enforces thresholds. When we amplify, it constrains. When we quiet, it recedes. The handler held him on the sentence. Define amplify. Synchronized mass activity, he said. Emissions, launches, stacked drills, big crowd flows. Anything that raises broadcast footprint beyond a tolerance. It presses then, frames harden, spectrum goes unexpectedly clean, movement inside the edges slows. Define recede. Deconfliction, he said. Staggered windows. Quieter bands. The frames thin or drift off. The same corridors pass with no clamp. Behavior inside frames. An interior point, call it a roamer, patrols the vectors most likely to tip, he said. It loiters over nuisance sensors before they resolve, sits above oscillations before they damp, hovers over abort vectors before the scrub call never comes. It's not rescuing, it's managing. Temporal window. Long, he said. Not headlines. It thinks in spans that keep neighborhoods quiet. We force visibility by being loud, not because it arrives. Human effect. Brief motor reluctance, he said. Seconds. Voices stay calm, hands hesitate. Wearables notch HRV. Nausea for some metallic taste, skin warmth. It's proximity to shaping fields, not a message. Risk. Proportional to amplification, he said. We escalate, it clamps harder. We choreograph, it backs off. The risk isn't morality, it's physics in a policy suit. Origin, the handler pressed. How long installed? Older than our constellations, he said. Younger than our myth's first ink. We built habits around a thing we didn't admit existed. Who else knows? They don't say it, he said. But offices touching debris, grids, ascent, and spectrum keep bumping the same invisible hand. Their language, anomalies, unexpectedly clean windows, is posture that already assumes management. Geometry specifics. Base ratios hold within tight bands, he said. Equilateral spacing scales with altitude. Frames reconfigured to maintain those tolerances under wind, drift, and load. That's trilateration in the wild. Field signatures. Narrowband microwave. Ticks when clamps form, he said. Occasional short gamma blips near managed failure modes. Not everywhere, not lethal, just enough to do work. Underground. Quiet routes underfoot, he said. Vitrified bands along walls like guide rails. Embedded magnetic flex, residue from tools or transit we don't catalog. Corridors align with surface corridors and aerial frames during loud windows. Intent. Minimize broadcast footprint, he said. Keep trajectories, objects, signals, human flows, inside corridors that leave fewer scars. The handler tightened the focus. Demonstrate the rule. Launch surge, he said. Frames form over ascent bands 20 minutes before window. Spectrum notch slides clean during stress. Roamer loiters near nuisance telemetry. Clamp dissolves after nominal SEP. Grid peak. Equilateral hold over transmission spine. Oscillation damped. Frames drift once load eases. Drill night. Emergency rectangles snap on. Reluctant wrists in cockpits. Triangles hang until clocks unstack. Counterfactual. Quiet posture, he said. Stagger windows, refine bands, deconflict corridors. Frames thin. Geometry doesn't vanish, just stops needing to harden. Contact risk. Attention itself is pressure, he said. We press with loud probes, the membrane thickens. We map without amplification, it tolerates us. Final descriptor, the handler said, pen ready. Coordinating intelligence using geometry as interface, the viewer said. It shapes behavior through fields, not orders. It is not a visitor, it is installed. The handler broke script. Why now? Because we're louder, the viewer said. 11,000 satellites and counting. Lasers, phased arrays, stacked launches. 2025 is saturation. Our noise drags its frames into view. Testable claim? Stack calendars over maps, he said. Amplify and watch clamps. Quiet and watch space return. Silence held a few seconds longer than protocol likes. The handler clicked end, then wrote the sentence he couldn't unhear where someone else would later black it out. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. Verification layer, the body doesn't lie. They pulled the polygraph not as a truth machine, but as a pattern check. Does the body move like memory or like invention? The unit didn't rely on old needles alone. By the early 1990s, they were stacking channels. Respiration, heart rate variability, skin conductance, vocal microtremor. Then looking for cross-signal harmony. In fabrication, channels fight. Breath smooths while voice jitters. Pulse spikes while skin stays flat. In recall, they couple and rise together like gears under load. On the session segment where the viewer said installed, the traces behaved like recall. Respiration and HRV coupled. Skin conductance crested inside the viewer's normal arousal envelope. Vocal tremor stayed within bands the unit sees in pilots debriefing near misses. Elevated, organized, not ragged. The examiner wrote carefully. Synchrony across channels consistent with memory-based recall. Beneath, the hedge the unit lives by, sincerity is not equal to validity. And from a second pen, the counterweight, but not deception. They added voice stress spectra because microphones remember Shakes, ears don't. Analysts mapped microtremor bands across the words that mattered, frames, damping, triads installed. The tremor neither flattened like rehearsed delivery, nor spiked like on-the-fly invention. It rode in the corridor they log when operators narrate events they endured and wish they hadn't. Stress yes, but coherent stress. Medical walked in on its own clock and refused drama. Clinic note: transient nausea, cutaneous warmth at temples and forearms, metallic taste. No dosimeter, no headline. But those three might as well be a stamp. Substation techs under oscillations report the same triad. Radar rooms after long burns, same. Households in hotspot valleys during knock nights that end with a neat gamma blip on an environmental logger, same. Pattern not proof. Still, the word consistent kept following the symptoms into other files. They ran the cross-signal lag test, a small trick borrowed from aviation medicine. In recall, respiration leads HRV by a consistent phase offset. In confabulation, the coupling wanders. When you amplify, it constrains, the coupling tightened. During the viewer's own metaphor grab, maintenance paths under our feet. It loosened, then retightened when he corrected back to geometry. That's not a storyteller gilding. That's a witness wrestling language into shape. There's a cheap ring log, too. The viewer wore a consumer band home. At 3:11, the minute the custody sheet shows the classification jump, the overnight trace recorded a brief HRV suppression. Coincidence? Probably. But tempo matters. The room thickened when the packet hopped a caveat. The body noticed. Polygraphs don't certify the external. They narrow culprits. If not deception, then what? Trauma can engrave false order on chaos. Suggestion can. Stage physiology. So they went hunting for replications outside the room. 3 legacy sessions in the archive showed the same odd pre-target interference signature on the EM logger, glitches before words. 2 of those had post-session clinic notes with nausea-warmth metallic taste, and both lined up, within 12 hours, with verified equilateral holds over active corridors caught by civilians. That doesn't collapse distance to truth. It does shorten it. Meanwhile, bodies in the wild behaved like maps. Pilots who reported reluctant controls, under triangles later surfaced wearable traces. Tiny HRV notches at the exact minute the flight log circled. Families who fled knock cascades described calm voices and uncooperative legs, a mismatch the session predicted. Hospital clusters near persistent hotspots logged nonspecific dizziness and headaches in windows that matched narrow microwave pips on municipal sensors. The word nobody wants, correlation, showed up with a friend, replication. They added one more instrument to clip the outliers, spectrosemantic drift. It measures whether a speaker's vocabulary narrows toward operational nouns under stress, a recall sign, or expands into metaphor, a fabrication tell. On frames, equidistant roamer, the viewer's nouns tightened. On operating system, metaphor tried to leak in and got choked off by the handler. The drift score lined up with debriefs from range controllers who say, unexpectedly clean, rather than mysterious grace. Operators flee poetry when the thing matters. Skeptics in the unit stayed loud where they should. One stamped artifact on a copy of the biometric summary, like the word could banish a shape. Another rewrote it as unauthorized contact. 2 scrawls, same data pile. Neither pen can make physiology pick a team, but both hands admit the same baseline. The body moved like recall, not rehearsal. So the verification layer doesn't knight a governor. It strips suspects. Not lie. Not easy fantasy. Not neat hysteria. What's left is contact or contact-like pressure. The kind that makes rings notch at wrong minutes, voices stay calm while wrists hesitate, and clinic notes reuse the same bland nouns across files that pretend not to know each other. That's where the rule earns its keep, because it leaves the body an A/B test. Stack loud windows and watch clamps ride physiology, HRV notches, skin crests, reluctant wrists. Stagger and quiet, and watch the traces flatten. You don't have to call it installed to see what happens when you press. The body doesn't read memos. It reads fields. The map that shouldn't exist. They didn't start with belief, they started with clocks. A junior analyst stacked 3 independent timelines on a dark screen. Time-verified civilian videos, public launch manifests, and FAA/NOTAM windows. He expected mess. He got alignment. In weeks when launches stacked, debris warnings lit crowded shells, and militaries ran drills, Equilateral formations appeared with a cadence that looked less like spectacle and more like scheduling. 3 days earlier, something odd had occurred. A triad pinned an Atlantic ascent corridor 20 minutes before a heavy lift. The interior roamer slid to a point that later became a minor telemetry nuisance at main engine cutoff, then eased away after nominal separation. Mission completed. No headline. The formation dissolved like a stagehand slipping behind a curtain. Stack enough of those nights, and the rhythm stops feeling lucky. While that was happening in New Mexico, a range controller filed a spectrum plot he didn't have a box for. He circled a moving notch and wrote, "Unexpectedly clean," where the form offered interference. The quiet band tracked a frame hanging high over a hypersonic trial. Upstream, emergency rectangles blinked over airspace with no listed hazard. The drill clock ran. The sky's handwriting matched the schedule's nervous coughs. Unknown to them, across town, a city utility flagged 3 narrow microwave pips during a heat wave oscillation. The oscillation should have propagated down the corridor. It didn't. That night, faint equilateral points idled above the transmission spine. In the morning, the incident existed only as a unit's gut and 3 bumps on a municipal logger. The overlay kept adding hands. In the Pacific, sailors on picket duty filmed triads drifting along missile lanes as exercises spun hot. Off Poland, long-lens clips caught triangles holding equidistant over restricted corridors while air traffic below slowed without orders. Reluctant controls, one pilot wrote, annoyed at his own wrist. Over Brazil, a farmer's phone captured lights pacing a hydro corridor as turbines surged to cover a regional shortfall. His dog lay down like gravity thickened. Hours later, the grid report showed a wobble that never bloomed. They tried to break it. They removed Starlink trains, culled ISS passes, mapped sun angles and lens ghosts, subtracted radar flights and commercial patterns. The residue refused to smear. Base lengths held inside tight bands across latitudes. Roamer paths correlated with vectors that would show non-nominal readings minutes later. Moving clean bands and spectrum overlapped clamp windows overhead. Nobody declared intent. They posted replication code and dared colleagues to subtract the shape out of existence. A grad student in the Azores stacked a public debris alert over a verified long-exposure clip and an anonymized downlink plot. At 2013 Universal Time coordinated the warning went live. At 20:15 a.m. tiered set of frames pinned the crowded altitude. At 2027 the spectrum notch glided through. At 2043 the geometry eased away. He named the screenshot shouldn't_exist.png. Then stopped joking when the same posture reappeared during a scrub 2 months later. Controllers noticed ground behavior inside the boxes nobody labeled. Trucks idled longer before entering corridors. Patrols loitered at intersections, and only later realized they'd added 90 seconds to nothing. In cockpits, 3-second wrist hesitations occurred exactly when equilateral holds formed at altitude. Instruments stayed boring. Voices remained calm. Meanwhile, downlink operators kept writing "unexpectedly clean" on nights that were supposed to sound like rain on a tin roof. Chain of custody mattered, so teams overdocumented. Every civilian clip they used carried original EXIF, device hash, GPS, and time. Every airspace restriction came from public notices. Every downlink plot included a signature block or a redaction attested by a trusted intermediary. The overlays didn't prove a who. They constrained the what. Equidistant nodes form, and interior loiter tracks failure vectors. Spectrum cleans during load, frames dissolve post-stabilization. Limits stayed loud. Models can hallucinate. Optics can lie. Trained swarms can fly clever. So the map relied on what repeated under subtraction. Base ratios inside narrow tolerances. Proportional scaling with altitude. Roamer paths predicting nuisance readings that settle. Human motor reluctance clustered under known holds. Rectangles snapping on with no printed hazard while the sky behaves like someone already drew a box. Not proof. Cornering. Then the hours nobody wanted. Launch 4 vehicles in 40 hours across 2 continents. Raise a crowded shell after a scrape. Run concurrent missile tracking drills. Cook a grid in heat. Frames nested at multiple altitudes over ascent lanes. Roamer paths hugged the vectors that would twitch. Spectrum slid clean when operators braced for chaos. The clamps didn't brag. They did enough. Stabilization without orders became a line men wrote carefully. Here's the repellent beauty. The map didn't demand belief. It demanded calendars. Stack loud windows, the geometry hardens. Stagger and quiet, it thins. The sentence the viewer left behind reads like a caption for the overlay. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. You can test it tonight without a badge. What nobody wrote on the plots, but everyone felt, was posture. This wasn't arrival. It was management. The formations moved like technicians pinching a membrane until ripple stopped, then letting go the second ratios dropped back inside tolerance. The map shouldn't exist because maps like this require admission. Instead, it lives in public overlays, cautious memos, and the quiet understanding that we're sharing airspace with an interface we didn't install and can't ignore. Protection versus surveillance, the double edge. From the maps, posture cuts two ways. At scale, what the geometry does looks like help, quenching cascades, deflecting hazards, masking noise when we're about to shout. At human range, the same fields press on bodies, trespass into rooms, and steer without consent. Benefit and injury braided by function. Start with the saves nobody will call saves. After a 2024 scrape scattered fragments through a crowded shell, long exposures caught tiered frames pinning the altitude while a moving clean band slid through spectrum. Debris didn't spawn a chain reaction. Launch windows reopened on schedule. Range controllers wrote, unexpectedly clean, during runs that should have sounded like static storms. The clamps didn't announce themselves. They did enough and left. Meanwhile, the ground remembered the bill. Houses in hotspot valleys logged nights of bangs and footfalls that moved through walls like a drill team. Families fled to trucks with blankets and dogs that wouldn't go back inside until the sun touched the ridge. Environmental sensors downrange recorded neat gamma blips. Nobody found scorch. Nobody found footprints. The field did its housekeeping. People paid in sleep and nerves. Pilots add the middle distance. A triangle holds at altitude. For 3 seconds, wrists don't translate intent, while checklists flow like nothing happened. After landing, wearables show tiny HRV notches they can circle with a pen. Instruments are fine. Words are fine. Autonomy is not. You get your body back in time to be annoyed at the log you know will read like superstition. Grid crews see the same bargain in steel and heat. Oscillations that used to walk the corridor now settle on their own the minute 3 points idle over a transmission spine, and a narrow microwave tick pops on a portable meter. Sags don't propagate. Transformers don't die. The tech goes home with cotton in his nose and a scribble that says didn't cascade. His ledger shows a save. His body shows a cost. Stack enough of those windows and the moral vocabulary begins to stutter. Surveillance or protection? Both if you care where the field lands. A clamp above a scent buys a mission. A clamp inside a living room moves a child out of an emission lane without asking. The system doesn't weigh feelings. It enforces thresholds. Interception stories whisper around conflict zones. Clips surface of luminous points approaching projectiles mid-flight, flashes, nothing. No ministry confirms non-human defense. Analysts fight over artifacts and context. The aftermath, no debris footprint where one should be, keeps showing up. Read it as defense at planetary scale. Read the same behavior at street scale as coercion. The geometry doesn't change. Your altitude does. Hospitals near recurrent hotspots collect symptoms nobody enjoys coding. Dizziness, nausea, headaches that don't map to leaks or spills. Timing overlays with municipal microwave ticks and occasional gamma flickers. Epidemiologists write careful caveats, as they should. Correlation isn't causation, but the stack refuses to scatter. If fields do the work upstairs, traces land in flesh downstairs. Now remember the rule the handler wrote where someone later put a bar. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. That isn't an ethic. It's a handshake. Loud windows, stacked launches, mass drills, grids ringing, draw frames, notches, reluctant wrists. Quiet choreography, staggered bands, deconflicted corridors, disciplined uplinks, buys back space. You don't need belief. You need calendars. The irony is ugly and practical. If a governor masks our broadcast footprint in a dark neighborhood, its clamps protect more than us. They protect whatever installed it. Silence enforced for survivability looks like oppression when you're the thing being moved out of a lane. You can call it surveillance with benefits or protection with side effects. Both phrases hide the same mechanics, fields shaping trajectories to keep ratios tolerable. Pushback belongs here. Sensors are twitchy. Gamma spikes flirt with false positives. Microwave meters lie in untrained hands. Some triangle nights collapse under known birds, flares, or misread skies. Subtract those. The residue still behaves like policy embedded in geometry, equidistant frames appearing before loud minutes, interiors loitering over likely failure vectors, spectrum cleaning exactly when you'd expect chaos, human motor reluctance clustered under holds, rectangles snapping on with no printed hazard. So how do you live near it? Not by worship and not by dares. By instrumentation and choreography. Publish emission dashboards so operators see when they're hammering the band. Stagger ascent and radar burns. Treat orbital neighborhoods like shared airspace, not dumping grounds. Equip clinics near hotspots with protocols for field exposure clusters so families don't get laughed out of tree of. Coordinate quietly and the frames thin. Amplify to bait the grid and you'll feel the clamp you provoked. This isn't surrender, it's torque. You reduce contact by becoming boring at the right hours. The upside lands where people live. Fewer reluctant wrists, fewer knock nights, fewer clinic notes that repurpose bland nouns. The sky answers choreography. It has for years. And if we refuse, if we stack 5 constellations in one corridor, light up phased arrays without discipline, run drills into each other, and call it strength, the geometry will keep teaching the only way it knows, by narrowing options until we choose inside tolerance. The double edge isn't a riddle. It's the price of being loud in a managed room. The dark forest frame, why silence would be enforced. While we argued about triangles, the planet got loud. By mid-2025, more than 11,000 active satellites stitched low Earth orbit. Lasers and phased arrays pulsed across bands. Constellations raised shells in crowded corridors, and civilian uplinks sprayed sloppy side lobes skyward. That isn't science fiction. It's NOAA charts, SatCat counts, and procurement lines that brag without adjectives. If you accept the rule, when we amplify, it constrains, then you've already met the logic behind enforced quiet. The sky isn't censoring speech. It's managing broadcast footprint in a neighborhood that punishes disclosure. Game theory calls this the dark forest. Survival favors silence because trust is impossible and tech ramps fast. You don't announce your location to strangers with unknown reach. You mask, throttle, and route so your noise doesn't become a target. In that frame, a governor isn't a tyrant. It's a firewall wrapped around a noisy species during a dangerous adolescence. Look at behavior, not claims. Orb clusters thicken when we shout, launch surges, debris blooms, mass drills. During quiet windows, formations thin but persist. Frames don't patrol for thrill, they hover like a hand over a volume knob. Space domain briefs in 2025 finally risked the word anomalies and pushed AI into every console because humans can't parse pattern of life at orbital scale. The language stayed careful. The budget lines didn't. Structured behaviors across orbital layers isn't debris mitigation. It's architecture monitoring architecture. Meanwhile, range logs kept writing unexpectedly clean during stress windows that should have howled. The clean bands aren't mercy. They're masking, moving filters that keep the band quiet while we strain systems in view of anyone with ears. Near misses sharpen the edge. After a 2024 collision scattered fragments, tiered frames pin the shell while a spectral notch slid through the mess. No cascading shard storm, no splashy headline, windows reopened. Read that as intervention or just clever masking of the worst noise. Either way, the posture matches the rule. Clamp when loud, release when ratios return. If it can't prevent every hit, it can at least keep our accidental beacon from broadcasting chaos into the void. Ground truth rhymes. A family's hard knock night that ends with a neat gamma blip reads like folklore until you remember firewalls reroute around live nodes. People inside a maintenance zone become obstacles to move, not observers to convince. The metallic taste, brief nausea, those are side effects of silent error handling, not stagecraft. At altitude, triangles stiffen. At street level, knocks clear a room. Same policy, different scale. Minimize signature while preserving function. Skeptics counter with distances and dust. Signals thin, stars are far, nobody's listening. Fine. You still throttle in a dark forest because the cost of being wrong is existential. And our leakage isn't ham radio. It's coherent beams, wideband constellations, high-duty sensors, and sloppy ground gear. Even if no one's out there, a prudent system acts as if someone might be. Act as if isn't paranoia. It's good engineering when feedback cycles can punish slow learners. Here's the practical ugliness. Silence protects more than us. If an installer values a quiet neighborhood, our feelings don't factor. The clamp that saves an ascent corridor and the clamp that moves a child out of an emission lane are the same function. At scale, we're beneficiaries. Up close, we're subjects. That double edge is why posture beats pride. We don't negotiate with speeches. We negotiate with signal hygiene. Stagger windows, deconflict bands, tighten side lobes, publish emission dashboards so operators see their footprints in real time. The viewer's line stops sounding mystical and starts reading like a scheduling policy when you test it against calendars. Amplify, stack launches, pile drills, raise shells, and the frames show spectrum cleans, wrists go reluctant. Quiet, stagger burns, narrow bands, space traffic sensibly, and clamps thin. That's a handshake, not a sermon. You can verify it with open notams, public manifests, and a decent Skywatcher's toolkit. Conferences are catching up. The Interstellar Research Group. Slated dark forest panels because the question isn't whether to whisper, it's how. How do you explore without painting a target on your back? How do you modernize without spray? The answer is boring and powerful. Treat the sky like shared airspace. Publish the quiet corridors. Incentivize compliance. Tie funding to emission discipline. Then watch the geometry back off. What happens if we refuse? If we slam 5 constellations into one corridor, light every phased array, and call clamping an insult? The frames will teach by narrowing options until we comply. The lesson doesn't require a voice. It arrives as rectangles with no printed hazard, reluctant wrists at the worst minute, and clean bands drifting through the dirtiest runs. It will feel like trespass in living rooms and like grace at altitude. It isn't either. It's policy at work. Installed systems don't ask permission. They enforce ratios. If you want fewer knocks and fewer clamps, become less interesting on the hours that matter. That's not surrender. That's how grown-ups share a neighborhood they don't own. The human layer, whistleblowers and pattern drift. While geometry wrote the big picture, people started talking in rooms that used to swallow their voices. After 2023's protections opened channels, testimonies drifted in from pilots, range controllers, grid engineers, and intelligence staffers. Different jobs, same friction point. Operations meeting patterns they couldn't name without breaking their careers. They didn't speak in folklore. They used ops floor words. A Navy petty officer on the West Coast described orbs hugging perimeter airspace on nights when missile tracking drills spun up. Logs called it weather, but the timing kept rhyming with clamp windows. A range controller stapled a spectrum plot he'd circled unexpectedly clean to a shift brief and stopped trying to invent a box that fit it. A commercial captain filed temporary motor reluctance, instruments nominal, after a triangle hold. These aren't UFO sentences. They're maintenance language carrying a shape the forms don't have fields for. The anomaly office stayed careful out loud. No verified extraterrestrial tech, hundreds of logged incidents, ongoing monitoring. But posture changed. Flight crews got a standard reporting channel. Stigma didn't vanish, it got caged. The second that happened, details sharpened. Wearables appeared in attachments. Tiny HRV notches circled at minutes that matched equilateral holds overhead. Range screenshots captured moving notches in dirty windows. Utility foremen appended microwave pips from substation nights when oscillations wanted to walk but didn't. Space Force never said frames. It didn't have to. Procurement lines hardened around AI literacy, across the enterprise and pattern of life analytics at orbital scale. Portable arrays quietly appeared beneath likely corridors hours before clamp windows. People living nearby filmed unfamiliar teams rolling out gear marked like Space Force issue, then rolling it back before dawn. No memo described why. The map and the calendar did that job. Whistleblowers filled the gap between careful language and real behavior. A radar tech with tired eyes said the quiet part into a protected mic. We stopped arguing what it is. We started planning for when it shows up. He described a pencil-written checklist taped beside his console. Stagger emissions during stress. Pre-designate quiet bands. Expect reluctant controls if geometry forms overhead. Escalate only if safety demands. That isn't belief. That's risk hygiene in a room that learned the rule without naming the ruler. Pattern drift means what people do changes before what they say does. Units began treating emergency rectangles like pre-coordination with a system they won't admit exists. Snapping boxes on without listed hazards when drills stacked, then snapping them off when timing quieted. Controllers scheduled quieting windows in advance, so the spectrum stayed clean by design instead of by clamp. Grid managers spread peak loads across valleys instead of spires. Launch cadence got nudged into less theatrical clusters. No press release confessed why. Operators don't write essays. They change schedules. Testimonies diverged in the right places and aligned in the ones that mattered. Navy crews talked incursions pacing training boxes. Commercial pilots described calm voices paired with 3-second wrists that didn't listen. Grid crews wrote about oscillations that didn't propagate on nights when faint points idled above lines. Range officers circled notches and wrote, unexpectedly clean. Different rooms, same skeleton. Skeptics pushed on provenance, as they should. Some clips collapsed under lenses and birds. A few breathless affidavits fell apart under timestamps. Those failures are useful. They prune the tree. What kept reappearing survived subtraction. Equilateral holds within tight tolerances. Interior loitering over failure vectors before stabilization. Spectrum cleaning during stress. Reluctant wrists under triangles. Rectangles with no printed hazard. The testimonies that stayed matched the map you can build with public clocks. Then there were the marginalia, the human edges that make policy real. A controller kept a felt-tipped circle around a moving notch taped to his console until the paper yellowed. A pilot showed his kid a small triangle made of blue bricks over a toy runway and said, "Like this," without explaining why. A utility supervisor wrote "Grace" in a margin, crossed it out, and replaced it with "Stability Event." Operators flee poetry until they don't. Then they hide it in the corners where nobody audits. Not every voice came wrapped in calm. A few described pressure to sit on reports or the career tax that follows a wrong noun. But the protections worked enough that the fear became an input rather than a muzzle. The Anomaly Office standardized intake. Space Force trained crews to treat unexpectedly clean as data, not a confession. Civilians built replication pipelines and published code so testimony could be checked against numbers, not vibes. Pattern drift isn't a confession. It's a weather vane. When units with budgets and badges quietly behave as if management exists, when testimonies rhyme with overlays built from open clocks, when schedules bend toward choreography that earns fewer clamps, language can lag a decade and the room will still know what time it is. So here's the human layer without slogans. We met a rule in the wild, then taught ourselves to live near it. The whistleblowers didn't give us a creature. They gave us a posture. And in their margins, under circles and cautious words, you can see the sentence we keep testing because it keeps paying out. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. Crisis beat, the moment everything changed. It stacked like we'd been rehearsing the trigger sequence without knowing. Launch surge first. For vehicles in 40 hours across 2 continents, constellations raising shells while a rival corridor tightened. Up top, a fragment cloud widened after a slow-motion scrape in a crowded band. Groundside, overlapping drills, missile tracking in the Pacific, hypersonic profiles in the desert, while a heat wave drove grids into elastic hum. Loud in every direction at once. 3 days earlier, a small rehearsal had whispered the posture. A triad pinning an ascent lane 20 minutes before window, a roamer sliding to a nuisance sensor that settled, then the geometry easing off after nominal separation. But on this night, the template scaled. Tiered frames nested across altitudes. One set at ascent, one at the crowded shell, one higher like scaffolding. The roamer patrolled interior vectors that matched the place's controller's circle in red grease pencil. Downlink operators wrote the same line in 2 rooms that don't share lunch. Unexpectedly clean, during stress windows that should have sounded like rain on sheet metal. While that was happening in New Mexico, a utility foreman watched unmarked teams plant portable arrays under a transmission spine that wasn't on any public plan. He didn't get a memo because there wasn't one. Minutes later, his SCADA showed a wobble that ought to have walked. It didn't. Above the corridor, faint points held equidistant, edge lengths breathing to a rhythm that matched load. He circled 3 bumps on a microwave trace and wrote "non-prop" in the margin like he was apologizing to physics. Unknown to them, across town, a range controller stared at a moving notch that refused to be labeled interference. He circled it, wrote "clean band," and underlined the time. Supervisors slid rectangles over airspace with no hazard listed. The drills ran inside boxes nobody would explain. On picket duty in the Pacific, sailors filmed equilateral lights drifting along a missile lane while the exercise clock ticked toward hot. The captures looked unremarkable until the rectangles snapped on, the frames held, and the timeline landed where the overlays said it would. Pilots felt the clamp and kept their voices boring. In holding over desert airspace, A captain logged temporary motor reluctance, instruments nominal, for 3 seconds while a black triangle hung like punctuation at altitude. Wearables later posted small HRV notches on the exact minute the cockpit circled. Below him, a family in a valley heard hard knocks roll the house, grabbed blankets and a dog, and watched a neat gamma blip appear on an environmental logger downridge. In the morning, nothing was broken. Their bodies had learned the rule the paperwork won't print. Emergency NOTAMs stacked like tiles, rectangles stitched over ascent lanes, test corridors, coastal approaches, captioned with sterile phrases and no reasons. Inside them, ground movement slowed without orders. Trucks idled at thresholds, patrols loitered at intersections, and only later did anyone realize they'd added 90 seconds to nothing. At altitude, frames reconfigured to preserve base ratios under drift. The roamer loitered over vectors that would twitch, then slide back into tolerance. Spectrum stayed clean where it should have screamed. Controllers wrote proceed, with a question mark in their throats, and found nominal at stage separation anyway. The moment that changed the room wasn't a light, it was stabilization without a human command. A booster on a high-stress profile threw a sensor flag that historically tips missions into scrub. The reading damped back inside limits while a formation held over the corridor. Uprange, the notch glided through the dirtiest band. The mission continued. Nobody wrote assist. Everybody logged as if help had been given. By dawn, the posture was everywhere you looked if you knew where to look. Frames nested, roamers patrolled, rectangles blinked, spectrum slid clean, wrists went reluctant, houses knocked, grids held. The clamps moved like technicians pinching a membrane until ripple stopped, then letting go the second ratios dropped. It wasn't arrival. It was governance, policy embedded in geometry executing, because we'd stacked every loud window at once. That's when the sentence stopped being a line on a pad and became inventory. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. We'd amplified across domains, and the sky answered like it always does. Edges, not speeches. Fields, not orders. Enough pressure to steer us back inside tolerance without asking who was in charge. The smoking gun we can actually show. Here's the part that stops being mood and starts being math. Synchronized timestamps across independent systems, each with clean provenance, pointing to the same geometry, doing the same job before the same kinds of events. Start with equidistant triads you can audit. 3 independent teams, Arizona, Poland, Brazil, published original files with EXIF, GPS, device hashes, and UTC. Each clip survived subtraction. Known satellite passes culled using public catalogs, ISS windows removed, sun angle artifacts mapped and excluded, commercial flight tracks reconciled. What remained looked dull until you measured it. 3 luminous nodes maintaining equidistant spacing within tight tolerances, while the base length scaled with altitude estimates. Proportional scaling derived from parallax. In Arizona, the median base measured 1.7 kilometers. In Poland, 2.1. Off Brazil, 1.9. Drift didn't smear spacing. Frames reconfigured to preserve ratios. That's template behavior. Now paste in the spectrum. 2 range sites, 1 civil, 1 defense adjacent, released anonymized downlink plots with signed timing blocks or intermediaries attesting chain of custody. On nights when verified frames fixed overhead, both archives showed short, clean bands, moving notches sweeping through the dirtiest slices exactly when stress should have peaked. Neither plot labeled intervention. Both wrote, unexpectedly clean, in notes operators never wanted to write twice. The alignment was temporal, not rhetorical. Clamp forms, clean band sweeps, clamp dissolves. Layer and ground arrays where cameras caught them without invitations. Civilians posted time-verified photos of portable sensors, stood up beneath corridors hours before clamps. Positions triangulated within tens of meters of the aerial formation's projected ground tracks. No public hazard was posted. The arrays appeared under likely windows, then vanished before breakfast. Nobody said cooperation. The geometry and the schedule said choreography. Then the roamer, our interior point. In 3 separate incidents with full provenance, the roamer slid toward the vector that would throw a non-nominal reading minutes later. An engine test trending out of family before auto-abort. A transformer ringing toward instability before oscillation damped. A booster sensor flag that settled back inside limits without scrub. The sequence repeated. Proximity precedes stabilization, not follows it. The roamer didn't collide. It loitered over the problem until it wasn't. Add one composite that shouldn't hold together and does. Over the Atlantic, a long exposure clip with EXIF intact captured tiered frames pinning a crowded shell in the hour after a debris alert went public. At 2013 Universal Time Coordinated, the alert posted. At 2015, the formation's fixed. At 2027, a signed downlink plot showed the moving clean band sliding through the same altitudes. At 2043, the geometry eased away. 3 datasets, 1 window. The operators wrote no poetry. The overlays didn't need it. Skeptics demand replication steps. They got them. The civilian groups published their filters and code. How to reconcile time zones, subtract catalog passes, estimate altitude with frame-to-frame parallax, and measure base ratios inside tolerance. Colleagues in Manila and Krakow reran the pipeline and landed on the same skeleton. Equilateral sets, proportional scaling, interior loitering over failure vectors, and clean bands and spectrum plots during clamps. Not an origin story, an operations signature. Chain of custody matters, so here's the hygiene. Every civilian clip we cite includes original file, device model, hash, capture coordinates, and time. Every spectrum image includes a signature block or an attested redaction path. Every airspace restriction comes from a public notice you can pull tonight. Every launch manifest alignment uses public sources. When provenance was mushy, the data didn't make the stack. The pile you're seeing stands on files that survived subtraction. Limits aren't decor. Geometry doesn't confess motive. Advanced human systems exist, and trained swarms can perform. But trained swarms don't persist across continents with base ratios inside narrow bands, while roamer paths predict nuisance readings that settle. Clean bands don't drift through the noisiest windows on nights when clamp geometry hangs high unless something is enforcing quiet. You don't have to decide who. You only have to admit what repeats. Now the tiny human hooks that lock this down. A cockpit log reads temporary motor reluctance, instruments nominal, at 2231 Universal Time Coordinated. The wearable trace notches HRV at 2231. The overlay shows an equilateral hold above that corridor at 2230 through 2233. A range console screenshot with unexpectedly clean, circled sits beside a civilian clip of a triad holding above the run. A substation microwave trace with 3 narrow pips lines up under a faint formation idling over the line during a heat-driven wobble that never propagated. These aren't legends. They're receipts. Here's the soft cliff. The viewer's line, "It is not a visitor, it is installed," reads like theater until the datasets refuse to separate. Equilateral frames form before risk peaks. Interior points loiter at failure vectors until stabilization. Spectrum slides clean when stress should howl. Geometry dissolves when ratios fall back inside tolerance. Clocks, plots, hashes. The smoking gun isn't a saucer photo. It's a schedule written in edges that keeps showing up when we're loud. Disclosure, what the entity is and why it's here. Call it what the session circled and the maps kept implying, an installed coordinating intelligence that uses geometry as its interface. Not a ship, not a fleet. A self-healing lattice that hardens into frames when ratios threaten to run away, then thins the second we drift back inside tolerance. The smarts live in structure, equidistant nodes, proportional scaling, interior patrols that loiter over failure vectors until stabilization. Mechanics aren't theatrical. Fields do the work. Narrowband microwave ticks shape and signal at close range. Short gamma blips appear as byproducts when it manages failure modes. Frames define edges. Inside, friction feels wrong for a breath, motors hesitate. Small drones drift along vectors that rotate with the geometry. In orbit, hubs anchor tiers. Underground, maintenance paths keep geometry quiet. Same template, different scale. Purpose reads like policy, not myth. Minimize broadcast footprint, damp cascades, steer trajectories, objects, signals, mass movement, back into corridors that leave fewer scars. It shadows risk windows, nukes spiking, grids ringing, ascent bands hot, shells crowded after scrapes. Loud posture drags it into view. Quiet choreography buys space. Why now is simple. We got loud. 11,000 satellites, lasers, phased arrays, stacked launches, sloppy side lobes. 2025 is saturation. Space domain planners wrote anomalies. Operators circled unexpectedly clean. And rectangles snapped on without listed hazards because behavior already assumed management. Disclosure, then, isn't a press conference. It's calendars that verify a rule you can test tonight. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. The why, consequence, and choice. If you strip away the adjectives and just watch the behavior, the governor answers one question over and over. How do you keep a noisy, accelerating species from turning itself into a beacon or a chain reaction? The consequences land on two timelines that don't balance cleanly, species scale and human scale, and neither asks our permission. At species scale, the benefits are real and boring in the way good engineering is boring. Debris windows that should cascade don't. Range runs that should sound like static storms slide unexpectedly clean. Oscillations that used to walk down corridors settle where they start. Launch profiles cross their worst minutes with a geometry hanging high like a hand over a volume knob. You don't get headlines for the disasters that don't happen. You get timetables that hold, and operators who write proceed with a question mark and find nominal anyway. At human scale, the bill comes due in plain, impolite ways. The 3-second pause in a wrist while a voice stays calm. The metallic taste in a living room that just emptied itself with knocks. The late-night clinic line in a county that sits under a persistent corridor, dizziness, headaches, nausea, without a leak to blame. A tech with cotton in his nose who knows a cascade didn't walk because 3 points idled over steel. Nobody asked him if he'd trade the nosebleed for a blackout that never happened. The choice got made upstream by a policy embedded in geometry. That's the why that isn't mystical. Silence is enforced because risk is proportional to loudness, and loudness scales with our appetite to stack schedules and spray bans. The governor's objective isn't to win an argument. It's to keep ratios tolerable in a neighborhood that punishes sloppy disclosure. If masks and clamps protect our missions at altitude, they also protect the installer's intent. We benefit as passengers, we chafe as pedestrians. The double edge isn't malice, it's function. So what do you do when the trade is species-level resilience versus individual consent? You stop pretending the lever is moral and start treating it as operational. The viewer's line holds because it behaves like physics. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. That sentence hands you an unromantic choice: modulate inputs or meet clamps. There's agency in that, just not the theatrical kind. Agency looks like orchestration instead of speeches. Publish emission dashboards so operators see their spray in real time. Tie launch slots to quiet corridors the way airports tie departures to noise abatement. Stagger radar burns and ascent windows so stress doesn't stack into a single cinematic hour. Clean up side lobes on ground gear so your sloppy spill doesn't invite a clamp into a neighborhood that thought it could sleep. Treat orbital shells like shared airspace and deconflict the way grown-ups do when intersection rules matter. There's a medical layer to that choreography too. If exposure signatures rhyme, narrow microwave ticks and occasional gamma blips, then clinics in hotspot counties need protocols, not shrugs. Document onset and timing relative to local sensors. Equip small cold rooms for acute cases where fields roll through. Train triage not to laugh at knocks and nausea when the town's environmental logger just recorded a neat spike. You don't need a disclosure memo to protect neighbors from side effects. And there's a cultural cost. We like to equate freedom with volume, bigger beams, brighter skies, tighter launch clusters as proof of life. The governor's language is duller: modify inputs or get narrowed. It doesn't admire our pride or care about our announcements. It cares about thresholds. The choice in front of us isn't obedience versus rebellion. It's choreography versus clamps. What happens if we refuse? If we keep stacking 5 constellations into one corridor, light every phased array at once, run drills into each other, and call reluctance an insult? We already know. Rectangles with no printed hazard will keep snapping on. Spectrum will slide clean precisely when operators want to hear the storm, because the filter has to move to preserve quiet in the worst minutes. Wrists will hesitate exactly long enough to keep a body out of a field that's working. Houses will knock because someone drew a maintenance path through a living room we didn't know we'd built our habits around. The system doesn't escalate with speeches. It narrows options until we finally act like we share a neighborhood. There's a gentler path that still feels like a dare. Coordination scales better than defiance. Cities can publish their grid peaks like tide tables. Operators can schedule around valleys. Range crews can pre-declare quieting windows so the clamp doesn't have to paint one for them. Launch cadence can be nudged toward less theatrical clusters with incentives baked into access and insurance. None of this requires belief. It requires calendars and a willingness to be less interesting at the right hours. Will that buy back autonomy? Not in the way we fantasize. It buys back space. Fewer reluctant wrists, fewer knock nights, fewer spectrum notes that apologize for being clean. The geometry thins when we stop demanding it harden. That's not surrender. That's the most adult expression of agency you get in a room you don't control. And the meaning we keep trying to wring out of this, the story about who installed it and why, can live where it belongs, as a backdrop to whether people sleep through the night and rockets cross their bad minutes without a clamp. We're not being asked to solve cosmology. We're being invited to stop tripping the same interlock. If you want fewer clamps, become boring on schedule. If you want to feel the edge more often, keep shouting and call it courage. The governor's why is the simplest part of this whole mess. Damp the spikes that make you visible and brittle. Our why is the only question with teeth. Do we value the thrill of loudness enough to pay in clamps and side effects? Or do we trade a little theater for corridors that don't bite? The sentence the handler wrote, and someone tried to erase answers in the only grammar the sky respects: inputs and consequences. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. The rest is posture. The final page, the rule we keep breaking. They didn't want to file it because it wasn't a conclusion, just a sentence written twice in the viewer's hand, like he needed muscle memory to hold it. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. It read like superstition until the overlays started behaving like a manual. You can hear the line in the weeks we stack noise for sport. For launches in 40 hours, hypersonic profiles breathing downrange clocks, a fragment cloud widening a crowded shell, grids cooking in heat, loud in every direction at once. Frames nest at altitude, a roamer parks over the vectors that twitch, spectrum slides clean in the dirtiest minute, and risks go reluctant long enough to stop a bad choice. We call it anomaly. The geometry calls it Tuesday. A range team in the Pacific got tired of being taught the same lesson and tried something boring. They published a quieting bulletin a week in advance, pre-declared bands where the spectrum would stay clean by design. Commercial flights nudged ascent inside the valley instead of the spire. That week, controllers circled fewer moving notches, pilots logged fewer reluctant wrists, civilians filmed fewer equilateral holds. Nobody cheered. They just underlined the word reproducible. A city utility ran a similar dare with less poetry. They pushed a dashboard live that showed grid peaks like tide tables and bribed big users to duck under the worst minutes. The SAG stopped stacking into hours that begged for clamps. On nights when heat still wanted to walk, faint points idled over lines and a microwave pip popped, 3 breaths long, enough to settle a wobble that didn't travel. Fewer trucks rolled at 2 a.m. with cotton and coffee. The rule paid out like a coupon you can only clip if you plan ahead. Flights learned to schedule courage. One carrier staggered long-haul departures off the densest corridors by 20 minutes and tightened uplink discipline on ascent. Their crews still saw triangles, but not during the hottest minutes. Wearables stopped notching HRV at times that match equilateral holds. The safety board didn't write a white paper. The ops room taped a post-it, boring wins. The refusals are louder. A defense lab tried a stress exposure demo, stacked emissions, overlap bands, all the things the manual says not to do if you like sleeping through a night. Frames formed, a clean band slid through the storm, and 2 interns went to urgent care with nausea and metallic taste they laughed off until the nurse didn't. The team got the data they wanted, and the clamp they deserved. You can bait the grid. You can't complain about what shows up. A pilot who hated the idea of being nudged by anything he couldn't see flew the same route at the same time 2 nights in a row. Night 1, alone in a quiet corridor, nothing. Night 2, with drills stacked and uplinks sloppy, he hung under a triangle and felt his wrists lag while his voice stayed professionals only. He wrote, like someone pressed a slow button on my bones, then crossed out someone and left it blank. He didn't like the noun. He couldn't avoid the sentence. Families learned it backwards because the field doesn't announce itself with memos. In a valley that sits under a persistent corridor, people started turning off routers and staggering appliance use on nights when the county posts heat alerts. The knocks eased. The dog stopped sleeping in the truck. Nobody swore an oath to a governor. They just got tired of being moved around their own rooms. We keep breaking the rule because loud feels like proof. We stack launches for drama, sync drills because calendars are lazy, light constellations without deconfliction because the market likes graphs that climb. The clamp that follows isn't punishment. It's the same interlock flipping to preserve tolerances at a scale bigger than our pride. It will feel like trespass when it knocks your kid out of a maintenance lane, and like grace when it pins a shell that should have cascaded. The feeling doesn't change the function. If you want fewer clamps, make less news where it counts. Publish emission dashboards and tie access to discipline. Stagger burns and slots the way airports do when neighborhoods matter. Deconflict shells like adults who share air. Equip YARs in hotspot counties with a boring protocol for field exposure, so knocks and nausea stop sounding like folklore. Pre-declare quieting windows at ranges, so the spectrum stays clean by design. None of that requires belief. It requires calendars and a willingness to be uninteresting on schedule. The last page the handler filed wasn't a revelation, it was a lever. You can pull it with launch manifests, range timetables, grid dashboards, and hospital intake forms. Pull it, and the geometry thins. Ignore it, and rectangles with no printed hazard will keep snapping on, wrists will keep hesitating, and operators will keep circling, unexpectedly clean, in bands that ought to roar. We keep asking who installed it and why. The sky keeps answering with a simpler question. How much do you want to pay for being loud? The sentence we tried to black out is the only honest guidance we've earned. When you amplify, it constrains. When you quiet, it recedes. The rest is whether we like the sound of our own voice enough to live with the clamp. The call hit his kitchen at 5:42 a.m., right as the toaster lever popped. Hold launch. Lights on the corridor. He left the English muffin on the plate, butter sweating into the bread. 10 minutes later, he was staring at a faint triangle holding steady above the ascent lane, a fourth point sliding like a cursor to the nuisance sensor everybody hated. The scrub posted with 3 sterile words. He ate the cold half at noon and tossed the other because it tasted like the word proceed. Sounds. A controller on midnights taped a Spectrum printout to the side of his console because the form didn't have a box for moving quiet. He'd circled the notch with a felt tip and written, unexpectedly clean, then drew an arrow to the time. He left it there until the tape yellowed, and he stopped noticing his own handwriting. A substation tech had a joke halfway out of his mouth when the warmth crept up his nose. The oscillation on the screen should have walked the corridor and rung neighbors like a bell. It didn't. Outside, a marble-bright point idled above the steel for 3 breaths and winked out like a blink you feel from the inside. He finished the joke later, and nobody laughed because the punchline had moved. A commercial captain kept his voice bored while his wrists hesitated under a triangle. Traffic in sight, he said, though the points didn't close distance. 3 seconds later, everything obeyed again. At home, he scrolled his wearable and circled a tiny HRV notch on the exact minute he'd logged the hold. He showed his kid a triangle made of blue bricks over a plastic runway and said, "Like this," and then changed the subject. In a valley house under a persistent corridor, the knocks started in the kitchen, for measured hits, then silence. The second set marched the stairs. The family grabbed blankets and the dog, slept in the truck, and watched dawn melt the frost-off fence posts. Down the ridge, an environmental logger flagged a neat gamma blip at 2:17. The mugs were still warm under the cabinet in the morning. The dog wouldn't go inside until the first patch of sunlight touched the floor. A grad student with a caffeine twitch opened 3 windows, a debris alert, a long exposure clip, and a downlink plot. 2013 Universal Time coordinated the warning, 2015, tiered frames pinning a shell, 2027, a moving clean band sliding through Spectrum. He saved the screenshot as shouldn't_exist.png, then stopped thinking the file name was funny when he caught the same posture during a scrub 2 months later. A utility supervisor wrote Grace in the margin next to 3 narrow microwave pips and crossed it out because it sounded like church. He replaced it with stability event and sent an email with no adjectives. Later, when someone asked what had changed, he pointed to a calendar where the peaks didn't stack anymore, valleys spread like tide tables. On picket duty, a sailor filmed 3 steady points above a missile lane while rectangles snapped onto the chart like someone had been waiting with a stencil. The exercise proceeded inside boxes no one would explain. He drew a red square over the still frame with his thumb. The corners matched. A city that got tired of clamps published a quieting bulletin a week in advance. Launches nudged into the valley. Range crews pre-declared clean bands. That week, fewer notches drifted through dirt, fewer wrists hesitated, fewer faint triangles showed up in civilians' clips. No one cheered. Someone underlined the word reproducible. A lab tried bravery as a metric and stacked emissions until the room rang. Frames formed, a clean band slid like a zipper. 2 interns went to urgent care with nausea and a metallic taste they laughed off until a nurse didn't. The data was beautiful. The lesson was the same. An officer who hated drama wrote a pencil checklist and taped it beside his console. Stagger burns, pre-cue quiet corridors, expect reluctant controls, escalate only for safety. He didn't say frames. He didn't have to. His handwriting did the admission for him. A pilot who wanted to win a private dare flew the same route at the same time 2 nights in a row. Night 1, quiet corridor, nothing. Night 2, stacked drills and sloppy side lobes. A black triangle hung and pressed his bones into slow motion long enough to make him swear under his breath. He crossed out the noun someone in his log and left the sentence without a subject. In a county ER that learned the hard way, intake forms got a new line. Timing relative to local sensor events. They kept a small cold room for the nights when knocks came before nausea. They stopped laughing at the words families used to describe pressure. A range tech thumbed a message to a friend at a different site. It's not magic. It's scheduling. He attached a photo, 3 circles on a printout, each with a time underlined. The reply came back with a single sentence, same here, different hour. A father folded the buttered English muffin he didn't finish into a napkin and found it in his pocket at the end of shift. He dropped it into the trash and watched it land like a small, stupid memorial to a scrub no one wanted to explain. The lesson isn't mystical, it's operational. When we stack noise, the sky hardens into edges. When we stagger and quiet, it thins. If you want to see how this rule plays out across other buried programs, watch the next one. Subscribe, send verified files with metadata, and help map the quiet windows so fewer nights end with knocks and clamps.